Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. I'm really pleased to have with me Dan Oliver. Dan's been with us a number of times before. He is the founder and managing director of Mermecan Capital. Welcome, Dan, and thanks for joining me again today.
Thanks for having me.
I would like to focus on a missive that you wrote for investors, I think back a couple of weeks back, maybe November 25th or so. You had some very interesting things to say there that I'm sure my listeners would find very intriguing and important. You noted that back in July, the betting markets gave Trump a 5% chance of winning the nomination, much less the presidency. And but then you said that you and your company were really arguing that Trump's victory was historically inevitable. And so I'm wondering, you were saying that based on your study of history, and so I'm wondering what the pollsters could have learned if they studied a bit of history that might have allowed them to get their predictions to be a little more accurate.
Well, that's a great question, Jay. I mean, it would be a surprise if any modern commentator look at what's happened in the past and try to learn from it, which is what people did for 2,000 years until all of a sudden we have this modernist view that everything is new, which, of course, nothing is new. But there were really two reasons why I thought Trump was going to win. And when I said historically inevitable, what I mean is a character like Trump, that was a natural evolution of our political system. And the two reasons are first, that the U.S. Constitution was self-consciously based on Republican Rome. And the Founding Fathers studied ancient government forms, especially the Roman Republic, and they tried to create a government that wouldn't fall into the empire that the Roman Republic fell into. But of course, I think that transition in a way is the natural order of things. And so I've called Trump our first emperor. And what I mean by that is that the emperors that came out of after the Republic did so because the infighting among the political parties in the Republic was so destructive to the wealth of the country, to foreign policy, to civic virtue, that the Romans basically decided that having one strong man, at least to give stability, was preferable to the infighting that had been going on before. And the emperors drew their power from the plebeians, from the lower ranks of society, which is why the sophisticated folks hated them, and all the histories that have survived say that they're obscene and they were vulgar and they were all sorts of other things, which of course is more or less what the press says about Trump, because it's the same sort of phenomenon where Trump is getting his support from the non-elites, from the downtrodden, and the elites of both political parties, as we saw, were pro-Hillary. Even Republicans who have been in government for a very long time preferred the status quo of a Hillary to the populism of Trump. So that was the first point. And the second point was that Trump's program, which is basically protectionism and internal improvements, is nothing new. And in fact, this is the very origins of the Republican Party. If we go all the way back to the Panic of 1819, Henry Clay and his Whig Party, he developed something called the American System. And the idea was that we were going to have high tariffs to keep British goods out. Well, we would use the revenue to fund internal improvements, canals and that kind of thing. And we would have a strong central bank that would coordinate the whole thing. That was the second bank of the United States. And so he set that up. It almost caused South Carolina to secede. This is in the 1820s and 30s. And as that panic faded, as people started growing again, they forgot about this very pernicious system until 1857, when another big panic came, and Abraham Lincoln, who was the first Republican president, ran on a platform of high tariffs and internal improvements. And he funded the whole thing with greenbacks, right? They printed all the money to fight the war, and that enabled him to do his program. And of course, the South didn't like it much because the South exported all the cotton, so they were paying all the tariffs, and all the money was being invested in the North. So that was one of the causes of the Civil War. This thing popped up again, this principle. Another Republican president, Herbert Hoover, in the 20s, the stock market bubble pops right after he becomes president. And what does he do? Tax revenue shrinks by half, he doubles spending, and the Federal Reserve goes crazy and starts buying all sorts of bonds. And he tries stimulus. Doesn't work, of course, but that's what he tries. And then you have Richard Nixon, another Republican, in the 70s. Again, the credit bubble that was blown up by Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s. cracked. And what does he do? He unleashes the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, to start printing money to have stimulus. He boosts his spending by 72%. Over his 6-year tenure. And so this is actually not anything extraordinary. This is, in fact, what always happens after a credit bubble, and it's always been a Republican that seems to implement this stuff. So those two reasons. It was where the United States is in terms of the cycle of history, and also what the natural reaction is to the bursting of a credit bubble of these three things. Internal improvements, tariffs, and the central bank printing money. And that's the rub, because Trump was campaigning against Janet Yellen's low interest rates, and she sort of stuck it to him by raising interest rates last week, right? And this system doesn't work. I mean, part of the point is that you print the money to make these improvements, and everything's wonderful. It doesn't work, of course, but that's the theory. And so here we have one of these three prongs not really working. And what's interesting is Yellen's term, I think, expires 2018. And it'll be interesting to see who Trump replaces her with, because here he was as a hawk in the campaign, but he needs a dove, a serious dove, to buy the infrastructure bonds that he's planning to sell to build the bridges and the wall and all the rest of it. So it's unclear exactly how he's going to manage this. He's a clever fellow. I mean, I think one shouldn't underestimate him, and that was the error the Democrats made. But he is stuck in this. In the situation where there is a massive credit bubble, it is going to pop. He doesn't want it to pop on his watch, obviously, and so the only way to prevent it from popping is to do more of what Obama did: more stimulus, more money printing, more all those things, which of course is the very opposite thing that he ran on. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
It sure will be. Well, I have to ask you though, Dan. It seems as though taking the bigger picture here, that Trump may be stuck with something much more serious in terms of the credit cycle than either Hoover or Nixon, in that the debt has grown so much greater, I believe, relative to GDP than at any time in the past. And also, you are, I think, you're looking at a bigger change here, more, historically a larger change. If what you're saying is Trump is our first emperor, then it seems to me that we have completely gotten rid of the idea of a republic then and have transitioned into an empire now. Is that what you're saying?
Well, let's talk. I mean, as an emperor-like figure. I mean, I don't think he's going to, be president for the rest of his life, kind of thing. But yes, in a way, I mean, Obama ruled by executive order. I mean, that is what emperors and dictators do, and it was very effective. I mean, a lot of it was illegal, and people would sue, and it would take them 3 years in the court to argue it out. And by the time the court decided against Obama, everything had changed, and so it almost didn't matter that he lost in the courts. And this is very effective. And I did see, I think this week he gave some advice to Trump not to use so many executive orders.
Yeah.
Unbelievable, right?
I saw that too.
Trump's, I mean, like, Obama's not the first guy to do this. I mean, Bush did it too, and Clinton did it too. But every president discovers they can push the boundaries further and further. And so Obama really, really pushed the envelope on this. And so Trump is going to be able to, first of all, unilaterally do a lot of what Obama did. Although, again, I mean, you can't bring back all the infrastructure in the coal industry, for example, that he destroyed. And I mean, there's certain things it's hard to undo. And then, of course, he can do it himself. The president has been set, and it's hard for the Congress to complain if Trump does it, given the fact they did absolutely nothing when Obama was doing it. So we have created a system whereby the president has enormous powers, not unimagined by the founding fathers. And what's interesting is, when Roosevelt came in the 30s, he passed the National Recovery Act, which was essentially American fascism. Industry had to organize into various groups, and then they could set prices privately, but they had the force of law, and the president got to review the whole thing. It was just based on Mussolini's system. And the Supreme Court overturned it because they said that the Congress, it was unconstitutional for the Congress to give the president so much power. I think Congress, really did much of the program on their own. But the point is that was the last gasp of, there are separation of powers, and Congress has things. I mean, ever since then, the presidency as an institution has grabbed more and more of the power, as has the Supreme Court, and Congress has really been left in the middle.
Too bad the courts didn't rule the same way with respect to the Federal Reserve when it was put into place, I think.
Well, that's right. I think that's a more complicated story. I mean, the Federal Reserve originally founded was not meant to buy government bonds. It was meant to discount commercial bills, but that's a very different
conversation. That's another story. But still, the Congress basically handed over the power to this private corporation, the Federal Reserve. So I guess maybe what you're saying then is, I mean, this is a populist move, but it isn't just happening here, Dan. It's happening around the world. We're seeing, Brexit. We're seeing France. We're seeing almost every place where the ruling elite has really held the upper hand. But will it be that much different under Trump? Or you're suggesting
it's not just every place; it's every time. In fact, when you look at previous times when there was too much debt and the effect of the populace was sunk under their debts, they turned to a populist. I mean, again, the parallels are very deep here. Julius Caesar, one of his planks in his platform was to get rid of interest payments for the little people. That's one reason why he was so popular. FDR was a populist. Franklin Roosevelt, who again came in the context of this credit bubble popping, used these fireside chats to bypass the meeting or straight into people's living rooms, and of course that's what Trump's doing with Twitter.
Sure,
so these things do repeat themselves all through history. It's not just now, but yes, I mean, to answer to your question, I think as long as the current banking system persists the way it is and the level of debts keep going higher, you're going to have more and more popular rejection of what is inherently an unjust system. What I'm interested by, of course, is that Trump ran as a populist, and the number of billionaire oligarchs that he's put into his cabinet is extraordinary. So it makes you wonder what his real program is. I don't really know. I mean, he's supposed to be the champion of the Rust Belt, and this is what drives the whole tariff conversation. But of course, that is not what caused the Rust Belt to disappear was not free trade. It was the credit bubble. Whenever the banks create too much credit, the domestic price level goes up. That encourages imports. It discourages exports. You get a big trade deficit, and the domestic industry disappears. And this something is written up by the Bullion Committee of 1810 in England that they discussed this, and they called it. They said the consequences of printing money are too obvious to require proof and too repugnant to justice to be left without remedy. I love the language from the 19th century, but the point is, this was something that they said was well known in 1810, and yet, of course, modern economists completely forgotten it. So tariffs aren't the answer. The answer is to fix that banking system that created this mess in the first place. But is Trump going to do that when he's appointing Goldman Sachs folks here left and right? It seems unlikely.
It seems unlikely. There was supposedly an economist, a lady, if I've forgotten her name now, who was a proponent of the gold standard, and Trump made some sort of reference to it in the past, but it hardly seems possible. And if anything, what you're saying is more of the same. More and more credit is going to be needed to do the things that Trump's talking about doing, and yet, Dan, very few people seem to be at all understanding of the monetary system and how important that is. It's sort of something that's just there. Nobody questions it. They used to question it, and the CMRE, an institution that you've been a part of, the Committee for Monetary Research and Education, of course, has its basis in that topic. But unless that changes, I think nothing gets fixed, right? Nothing goes back to
your point. The CMRE was founded in 1970 by Henry Hazlitt, and Jacques Rueff was involved, and all these wonderful people. And it was in the context of they organized a group to basically rebel against Bretton Woods, and in the 1970s, and all the inflationary problems, the banking problems, vindicated their viewpoint, and it was a very robust, important organization. Then what happened was, in the 80s. You had a huge credit bubble begin, and everyone making money. There's no goods inflation. Only inflation is in asset prices, what everybody loves. Everyone loves inflation. When asset prices inflate, they just don't like it when goods prices do. And so that conversation kind of died, and the organization got pretty moribund. And then the panic of 2008 happened, and all of a sudden there was renewed interest in the monetary system. Now that interest has certainly withered a bit because, again, like the 1980s, the market's been screaming higher. I mean, there's been a little bit of inflation in goods, but not a crazy amount. I mean, some things, healthcare and things like that, certainly, but it hasn't really been biting the way it was in the 70s yet. And so the interest it has sort of faded a bit. But I think we're always just one panic away from everybody taking an interest again. And part of the reason, Jay, is that I think I know, especially living in New York, all my friends and colleagues who work in the financial industry in whatever form, or other banks or private equity firms or law firms or whatever it is, they're all compensated on a transaction basis. They're all doing transactions. Nobody's paid big money to think about the whole system.
No.
So they don't. I mean, why would they? And in fact, It's almost a detriment, because you figure out how crazy the whole thing is. You might think, my God, what am I doing with my with my time? And that wouldn't be very productive. The idea is you want to extract as much money from the system as you can before it blows up. And so not thinking about it can actually help it in a way.
Yeah, and some of us who have been betting on it blowing up have been wrong. And the people that have just simply bought the mainstream ideas have made lots of money by going along the equity market. But okay, so we've had this bull market now for a number of years. And we're seeing the debt. We're seeing interest rates rise. I don't think, Dan, just because of Yellen. It seems to me there may be other factors. In fact, my view is that perhaps it's more market-driven, and Yellen is just simply following the demands of the market. We see a lot of foreign investors, for example, supposedly are stepping away from treasuries and not buying them to the extent that they were in the past. They have their own needs to use their resources, their financial resources, Europe, for example, and China and elsewhere. Do you think, the policies of tariffs and infrastructure, stimulus and all that would seem to be inflationary, and then if you dump, massive amounts of money being printed, do you think that there may be a shift now from the financial assets, which, as you know, people don't seem to bother? That's a form of inflation. The Austrians understand that's inflation. Yeah. That could come back into the real stuff, to the commodities, and we actually start to see some increase in inflation as the government measures it.
Well, it depends who you're talking about. My view is that one of the things that credit bubble does is it lengthens the structure of production to an artificial point. So in other words, China has built all these steel mills to build ghost cities everywhere, and one question is how many more ghost cities they can build before the whole system blows up. And there's lots of debt backed by those ghost cities that people think are valuable in China currently, and that will change, usually overnight. There's some panic. And then what will happen is all that overcapacity will get dumped onto the market. And so that will lower the prices of things like that. And that's why I think what would drive the big tariff wave. It's not just rhetoric on Trump's part. When the Chinese overcapacity hits the market, it will lower prices and be a direct threat to whatever's left of the Rust Belt. And the way you have to respond is either let your people go out of business or put tariffs up. And that's what happened in the previous iterations. And that's why tariffs found general support. So I don't know that you get lots of goods inflation if the Fed keeps tightening, because what will happen is people won't be able to refinance their projects, and all of a sudden the inventories will be thrown to the market, and all the inputs will be fallow, and so you get a lot of price declines. Now, if the Fed steps up and starts supporting the market as it did in the 70s, then you can get lots of price inflation, even as credit disappears. And that's one way to get rid of credit, of course, is you inflate your way out of it. But to do that requires a compliant Fed that's going to print the money to make that happen, as what happened in the 70s. And so that's why I think looking at the Fed is very important to gauge, are we going to get out of this in a deflationary way where everyone defaults in their debts, or an inflationary way where they're printed away? But in terms of gold, looking at gold, in terms of gold's real price, the price of commodities against gold, that doesn't care whether it's inflation or deflation. What that cares is which direction are credit levels headed. And when credit levels are going higher, then gold sinks in terms of commodities. And that is what's been happening since the election, because everyone thinks there's all this stimulus and he's going to unleash the banks, get rid of Dodd-Frank, and so on and so forth. And that is I think, natural reaction.
Right.
My own view is it'll be too little. I saw Caterpillar's numbers came out, and they've had their 48th consecutive month of declining global sales, and yet the stock price is going crazy.
All right, Dan, we're going to have to leave it go at that because we're out of time. Essentially, what I think you're saying is that we have some very, very strong headwinds against inflation. More than likely, we're going to see the real price of gold increase. Do I have you right? And if that's the case, then we might see a good scenario for gold mining companies?
Oh, I think so. Assuming that the stimulus isn't enough to bring the whole world out of its funk, which I assume it isn't. But that's the question.
Yeah. So there's also some parallels there. Trump and Hoover, perhaps.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, very good.
I mean, Hoover came to the office in March, and the market cracked in October. So, I mean, there was a little bit of a honeymoon for him, but that was the time frame, and the same thing can happen.
All right, Daniel. Well, unfortunately, we've got to leave it go there. Thank you so much for coming on with us today, and always a pleasure. We'll look to do it again sometime in the near future, hopefully.
Thanks, Jay.